I'm going to deal with C.S. Lewis, and this is something I prepared this week, which is so new to me to look into this. But who here knows what the four last things are? Anyone here? There's a free book for anyone who can guess the four last things. Just guess. What do you think the last thing in your life is going to be? Death. Okay, you've got one. What comes after death? Well, good. Okay. Judgment. Okay. Death, judgment, hell, and heaven. Okay. So we're going to go through those today because C.S. Lewis was a medieval and a Renaissance scholar. And when you go back to this period, about 1500, Hieronymus Bosch created one of the great works of art that Jim knows really well, Jim Bickford. And it is this tabletop done for Philip II, who bought it later on, basically called The Seven Deadly Sins and The Four Last Things. And so the four last things were things that were really focused upon during the Middle Ages. And we're going to go through these four last things. Philip Neri, who was the third apostle of Italy, you may know the first two, Peter and Paul, but Philip Neri has been called the third apostle, and it was the 16th century. And he said that the best way to prepare for death is to spend every day of your life as though it were the last. And I have students who don't even think of death until it strikes them. One of the things I did for a public speaking class years ago was make it very practical, and I took the students out to different places to kind of get real-life experience in speaking. So for job interviews, we went to a business concern, they sat there and talked. We went to kind of a wedding place where they could make up little toasts for everybody else. They don't know how to make toasts. And then I went to a funeral parlor with them to give eulogies. And I said, you can prepare any eulogy you want for a fictional person or a real-life person. And many of them kind of chose their pets, or they chose a grandmother that had died. And what happened to me was just amazing, because it was one of the first times they started thinking and talking about death. And they began to weep as they were giving these even false eulogies. So this was something I thought, what are we going to deal with these kinds of questions? And the first one we deal with is, here you can see, is death from Hieronymus Bosch. And you can see that the emaciated man is in bed there. He's got Wynne, who is there on the right, and then a couple other clergy there, then probably the vestry's in the back somewhere. But you see death coming into the corner there. But what is really interesting is up above the bedpost, you have the angel and the devil. And they're beginning to compete for the soul of this person who is going on. For Lewis, he tasted death in many different times and ways. And the first time was when he was about 10 years old. His mother died of cancer. And what struck him, he began to lose his faith because he said he prayed and she died. And so he gave up. And there was this idea that prayer is magic. He did not have an understanding of what prayer really is, this conversation with God. And so he lost that security and that stability and that foundation that his mother gave him. But his mother had given him other gifts that would go through. But this was the first taste he had of death. When he went to World War I, where Tolkien also served, his really good friend J.R. Tolkien, he went there and he saw men die on the battlefront. He was wounded himself and placed into the hospital. And so he had the experience there of death. During World War II, he began to kind of think about death again, because 80 years ago, this coming September, is the London Blitz, the anniversary of the London Blitz. And as we know, on one day, over 1,500 people died in London. The House of Commons was completely destroyed. Westminster Abbey was partly damaged, so was St. Paul's Cathedral. But what we saw was death there. And so they persuaded him, Dorothy Sayers and some others persuaded him to write a book on pain. And so he wrote a book called The Problem of Pain. He deals with death, and he deals with these four last things in this little book. But what's interesting is the distinction he makes between two kinds of knowledge. There is savoir knowledge, which those who've taken your elementary French know is to know about something, is to kind of speak about it, and kind of have this kind of conceptual knowledge of it. Connect means to know intimately, to have experienced it, to taste it. And so Lewis said both kinds of knowledge are important in our life. to experience it, to taste it, and to know about it. And what happened during these war years is his best friend, one of his best friends, Charles Williams, who wrote all these supernatural thrillers. He was an editor at Oxford University Press, and Lewis wrote, "You have heard of the death of my dearest friend, Charles Williams, and no doubt prayed for him. For me too it has been and is too a great loss, but not a dejecting one. It has greatly increased my faith. Death has done nothing to my idea of Charles, but he has done, I can't say what, to my idea of death. It has made the next world much more real and palpable. We all feel the same, how one lives and learns." So what he said, basically, put it in a nutshell, when he wrote Another Friend, he said, the idea of death has done nothing to my idea of Charles. But what Charles has done is changed my idea of death. It is not as frightening because it makes me believe even more in immortality and the afterlife. It helps me believe in resurrection because Charles is still so real. This photo up here is from left to right. That's Tolkien, then Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, and C.S. Lewis at the Trout. The Trout restaurant is on the Thames, and it's over in Oxford. And I think Wynn is going to lead you on a pilgrimage to Oxford next year. We've been taking people from Galilee to Oxford. We spend a week there, and you get to go to all these restaurants and drink like Lewis. You will drink a lot. Okay. But Lewis had one other experience of death that really changed him. And this is where the connector, the real experience came. Late in life, he married Joy Davidman. And Joy Davidman was this atheist, Jewish, ex-communist woman from New York City. And divorcee, everything. I mean, how could an Anglican marry someone like this? But she had read his writings and become a Christian. And when she came over to just visit him, their relationship was so wonderful. He married her in a civil ceremony to keep her there in England with her 2 boys. But then she was struck with cancer. It broke one day, and all of a sudden, she was dying. And so he went to the room, her hospital room, and he brought in a friendly vicar, and he said, I want to be married to her in the eyes of God. And so he married them there, and the vicar said, may I also pray for her? And he prayed for her, and she was healed. She was healed so much that for the next 3 years, they actually went on honeymoons to Ireland and down to Greece. And she was able to climb the steps of the Acropolis. And so you see this amazing healing, but then she died. And his life fell apart, and he wrote one of the most powerful books on death and dying called A Grief Observed. It is a book where he really wrestles against God, and he shakes his fist at the heavens and tries to understand what is going on. And here is where he had tasted death. And so death was there. And so it comes out as well in his children's stories. When you see Aslan, it is very much like Christ dying, and what he says, it gives children a sense of the sacrifice of someone who loves them, of God. And so Aslan dies, and it's one of the shocking moments in his book when children would read it in the 50s and say, this great God figure, what has happened to him? He's died that Edmund might live. But then he comes in the last battle, the last book of Narnia, and in here he really changes the idea of death for children. Suddenly death becomes a door to a wonderful place. And he writes at the end of that book, now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story no one on earth has ever read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. And so he gives this kind of hint of heaven that is going to come, that we must go through death first. We also know, too, the last kind of experience of death is when he died. He died November 22nd, 1963, the same day that Aldous Huxley and John F. Kennedy died. Peter Kreeft, who is a great writer, wrote a book called Between Heaven and Hell, in which the 3 of them get together and talk. And it's just brilliant because each of them is kind of expressing their own approach to all of this. Now, the second last thing is judgment. This is scary. Judgment is something we do not think about. The only time my students think about judgment is final exam time. I once asked them, I said, would you rather see, if you had not finished your paper and were not prepared for class, would you rather see your professor coming down the hall or the devil? 90% said the devil. The other 10% said they couldn't tell the difference. Okay. So we come to this last judgment, and the last judgment is when Jesus comes, and we see in Hieronymus Bosch, we see in other paintings, Michelangelo's The Last Judgment. This was a focus for the Middle Ages. People would look at this. These people were illiterate, but they could read the paintings. And the paintings taught them doctrine. The paintings taught them things. And those who come late will be judged even more. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. But here, what they are focusing on is appointed for men to die, but after this, the judgment. And here is one of the more difficult doctrines to deal with of the judgment, because the judgment is something that the Scriptures take seriously, but we do not talk about much in our churches. He wrote a book called an essay called The World's Last Night. And he says kind of the end of time, the eschatology that is there, what it tells us is that there is going to be a sudden, violent end. It's going to be imposed from without. An extinguisher popped onto the candle, a brick flung at the gramophone, a curtain rung down to the play and saying, halt, this is it. It is now time for judgment. And so he said, the doctrine of the second coming has failed so far as we are concerned if it does not make us realize that every moment of every year in our lives, John Donne's question, what if this present moment were the world's last night, is equally relevant. And we know that we and our friends are going to die. And it's something we do not think about, and the judgment is going to be there. I've just entered the winter of my life. When you get to be 71, you realize, okay, spring's gone, summer's gone, the leaves have come and fallen, but now we're in winter. And there's something about the winter of our lives that is so wonderful. I do another kind of study on laughter, and I just found that even though adults, older adults, do not laugh as much as children, this is the best time of our lives. We find that we can have joy and contentment and not worry about little things the older we get. There's a blessing that comes that is there, but we still have to think of our judgment. And so God comes and he plays pool with the earth and knocks it away, okay? This is how quickly it's going to happen. There it is. That's tomorrow, okay? Or in the middle of the sermon. Okay, there. He also wrote another book. He says, for judgment, our modern society judges God rather than realizing God is going to judge us. And if you want a religion that makes you comfortable, it's not Christianity. Worship yourself. Drink a lot of scotch. That'll make you happy for a while. But Christianity is going to disturb our universes. It's going to make us realize that we do not deserve positive responses. So he talks about the parable of the goats and the sheep. And you all remember when Jesus talked about him, he said, you know, the sheep are the ones who obeyed him, who listened to his voice. And he said, you can go off to my right. And the goats, you go off to the left and sit against the wall. Sorry, Dave. Okay, you're not a goat yet. But he divided them up. Now, one thing, Karen and I, my wife, we went to Scotland a couple years ago, and we went up through the Lake District up there. We stopped on this hill where this flock of sheep was. And so I got out of the car, and I saw this sheep, and they all started coming down to me. I thought this was great. All these sheep, I mean, there were about 100 sheep coming down to me. And Karen's just looking at me, shaking her head. And they come down, I go, my flock. And they turned and went away. They know the voice of the shepherd. And the sheep respond to the voice of the shepherd and not this kind of fake shepherd that might come and glory in them. But the question is, here, how are we going to divide Episcopalian sheep? Okay? We've got to realize that in the Scripture, not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, is going to enter the kingdom of God. Jesus attacks the religious people more than anybody else. And it's something to begin to examine our lives daily of what kind of fruit is God producing. But those are the sheep. Why goats are going to hell? Okay. My wife says I have too much time on my hand to find these kind of things all over. Or how the Lord takes us all. New York, Paris. From all the cities, God takes many, but from Las Vegas, one. Okay. Okay. Now, In the last battle again, Lewis deals with judgment. And he says basically what happens at the end of time, after everyone has died, they come in and they look straight in the face of Aslan. And he says, I don't think they had any choice. When some looked, the expression of their faces changed terribly. It was fear and hatred. And all the creatures who looked at Aslan that way swerved to the right, his left, and they disappeared into a huge black shadow, which streamed away to the left of the doorway. The children never saw them again. I don't know what became of them. But the others looked in the face of Aslan and loved him, though some of them were very frightened at the same time. And these came in the door on Aslan's right. And so it's the idea that when we're at judgment, we're going to look at the face of God. Now, this is kind of a doctrine that Lewis kind of creates that is not, it's extra biblical. It's not against Scripture, but it's something that I kind of believe in too, that we are going to be judged after death, and there is still an opportunity for people who have been seeking God but never have heard of Christ or never seen the real Christ will actually see him and say, this is what I've been looking for all my life. He has a character in the last battle whose name is Emeth, which means truth. And this character comes and he's been worshiping a false god, but he knows it's not right. There's something not right. And when he sees Aslan, he falls on his face and he says, this is where truth is. And so many people have a distorted view of Christ, but it's only through Christ that we get to the Father. But people will still reject or accept him. But this leads to the division of heaven and hell. And hell here, what Bosch has created, the 7 deadly sins you can see in miniature. And I'm sure that some of you have broken all 7 this week. That's why we're here and we have that confessional. I love the confessional every Sunday. It just begins to kind of wash us clean that is there. But you have kind of lust on the bottom here. You have the greedy who are in kind of a pot of gold boiling. You have anger, which is kind of dividing you up, cutting you. All of these things, pride that is down there, but all of them there. Now, hell to us, to many people in popular culture, is this burning place that is there. Some of the reasons for that might be that outside of Jerusalem, there is a place called Gehenna. Gehenna is basically this kind of accursed place where they allegedly used to sacrifice children, burn children alive. And so they would abort and kill them there, like you burn garbage now. But you can find that here in Turkmenistan, there is, 50 years ago, they opened up this kind of gas source down there. They thought they were going to just let it burn out, so they lit it, but it's still burning. And so you get this wonderful kind of hint of what hell is in the popular imagination. In Matthew 25, the judge tells the defendants, "Depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." But this is imagery. It's not that hell is going to be full of fire. And so, but this prevalent image of fire is there because it combines the idea of torment and kind of a finality to who we are. So Lewis, during the war, wrote the screw tape letters because he didn't like all these people who said, well, your devil has horns, he's red, and he's got a tail. And he says, no, it's more than that. And so instead of all these kind of New Yorker cartoons, he said, I want to kind of give you a sense of what hell really is. And so he began to kind of change that. In fact, one cynical ghost goes down to hell and he says, they lead you to expect red fire and devils and all sorts of interesting people sizzling on grids. But when you get to hell, it's just like any other town. Okay? In the screw tape letters, he says, let me describe to you what I see hell as like. He said, I like bats much better than bureaucrats. I live in the age of managers, in an age of administration. The greatest evil is not now done in those sordid dens of crime that Charles Dickens used to paint. It is not done even in concentration camps and labor camps. In those we see its final result. But it is conceived and ordered, moved, seconded, carried, and minuted in clean, carpeted, warmed, and well-lighted offices by quiet men with white collars and cut fingernails and smooth-shaven cheeks who do not need to raise their voice. Hence, naturally enough, my symbol for hell is something like the bureaucracy of a police state or the offices of a thoroughly nasty business concern. It's a dog-eat-dog world. We must picture hell as a state where everyone is perpetually concerned about his or her own dignity and advancement, where everyone has a grievance, and where everyone lives the deadly serious passions of envy, self-importance, and resentment. In short, Washington, D.C. Okay. But his most detailed description of hell occurs in his Dante-like fantasy, The Great Divorce. And it's wonderful because it's a group of people in hell who are invited to go to heaven and take a bus ride to heaven, and they can stay if they want to. There is only one who stays out of all the others. The others want to go back. And he says it's kind of this gray place, and it's really dark, and you begin to kind of move yourself away from other people. And so what he says, and this is, I think, one of his great insights on hell. He says, hell is locked from the inside. God doesn't send people to hell. There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, your will be done, and those to whom God says, your will be done. God does not send anyone to hell. The logical argument is simple. If heaven is to be with God, and hell is to be separated from God, the choice is clear. One creates his or her own ending. As the character George MacDonald tells the narrator, all that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously desires joy will miss it. If someone wants God, if someone wants the truth other than themselves, God will find them. He will take every prodigal that comes to him. There is also kind of beyond this beatific vision of the wonderful idea, there is this miserific vision that he talks about, how misery is there. And I love the word misery. Misery, the Anglican Book of Common Prayer gives us that we are miserable sinners. And for a long time I hated that until I realized miserable means needing mercy. So we say, yes, I need mercy. Please give me mercy. Every day I see my wife. I'm a miserable sinner. I need mercy, and she gives it. For Jean-Paul Sartre, hell is other people. So let me put this in your imagination. If you were going to spend eternity with two people who you really disliked, think of them. What would that be like? Forever and ever and ever. You begin to realize how we create our own hells that are there. Finally, we get to heaven. And heaven is that kind of wonderful place where God brings his saints up. Now, there are images of heaven that we all think of from the movies. Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers singing This Is Heaven. I mean, heaven, anybody want to sing it? I don't. The choir's gone, so we can't do it. But here, people think that everyone's going to play harps in heaven. That's not the idea. The answer to such people, says Lewis, is if they cannot understand books written for grown-ups, they should not talk about them. All scriptural imagery, harps, crowns, gold, is merely a symbolic attempt to express the inexpressible. Musical instruments are mentioned because for many people, music is the thing known in the present life which most strongly suggests ecstasy and the sublime. Crowns are mentioned to suggest the fact that those who are united with God in eternity share his splendor and joy. Gold is mentioned to suggest the timelessness of heaven. Gold does not rust, and the preciousness of it. People who take these symbols literally might as well think that when Christ told us to be like doves, he meant that we were to lay eggs. So he goes against this kind of literal fundamentalist idea of what heaven and hell are. He begins to say, no, it's much more terrible and much more wonderful than we can even imagine with this. In The Great Divorce, it's wonderful because it is our true home. And our true home is there. And what we also find that when we get to heaven, God gives each one of us, it says in the book of Revelation, a little stone, a little white stone with our real name on it. It tells us who we really were in life and who we are now in his eyes. And most of us, even now, have not come to a full realization of who we are in Christ. And he is going to reveal that to there. But the fullest description of Aslan's country or heaven occurs in the last battle again. So all the kids are thrown into a stable door, and they find it a portal or door to the next world. When the Narnians go through it, they find themselves not in a smelly, dark stable, but in a huge land of light and joy. It is a place of youth. As Jill puts it, the professor and Aunt Polly aren't much older than we are here. Of health, Edmund's knee ceases to be sore, and the professor suddenly feels unstiffened. Of abundance, of beauty and freedom. They see groves of trees thick with leaves, and under every leaf there peeps out the rich colors of fruit, such as no one has seen in our world. Fruit compared with which the freshest grapefruit you've ever seen was dull, and the juiciest orange was dry. Notice how he appeals to the other senses. That heaven sometimes we think in the abstracts, but he puts it into a great meal. In fact, what is up there is more real than in these shadowlands that we live in now. We live in a land of shadows that things are not completely what they are. We are going to be much more brilliant and beautiful and exciting and interesting in heaven than we are now. And that is a wonderful thing. But it ends up with one of the most compelling and significant images of heaven, and that, in being with Christ, is the wedding celebration and the feast with wine and bread. Now, my daughter just got married this last summer, so I had to put this in. This is over at the Hermitage, where the wedding was something that was so wonderful, even though it cost me everything I own. You realize it's worth it. And it cost God everything he had to bring us to heaven. He says, no expense can be spared because I'm putting on a wedding for you. You are invited to the feast. And at the feast, you can eat and drink and laugh and talk with each other and realize how much you love each other. The weddings are the best place and the best hint of what God is going to do. And so we close with this idea. Lewis writes, at the same time, it is possible for us to become too concerned about what heaven will be like and to spend too much time thinking about the next world instead of carrying out our Christian and civic duties in this world. Lewis warns against that firmly. It is of more importance for you or me today to refrain from one sneer or to extend one charitable thought to an enemy than to know all the angels and archangels know about the mysteries of the new creation and the new Jerusalem. So this is our job. Our job is to love one another and to be thankful and to realize the serious business of heaven that we begin to practice now is joy. Thank you.
One of the images has always intrigued me as far as judgment is in the last battle where, and you mentioned about the stable that is not a smelly stable but is just beautiful, fragrant place. But then there are these guys there that are sitting in a circle. They're not looking around, and they're convinced, even though that they're in this incredibly beautiful place, they're convinced it's a smelly stable. Could you just comment on that?
That I think those are the dwarves. The dwarves are there, and they're so cynical that they will not believe in something good because they've been fooled so much in life. And most of us, if we've been fooled and we've been had, we're very suspicious about everything. And that's one of the problems, that we do not go with innocence and hope to meet anybody. They might take advantage of us, but that's fine. The Lord says, if someone wants your shirt, you give them your cloak as well. And if someone's going to take advantage of you. But if you begin to live in a cynical way, we become like the dwarves, and we do not see the glories of God around us. And we just distrust all kinds of people, instead of saying, no, God has called me to love you and to love one another. But yeah, they're wonderful characters.
I love that image.
It's a great image, yes. Good. Yes, please.
Obviously, you're personally invested in Lewis. I'm curious, apart from this subject, what your favorite work of his essay or book, and maybe what passage in your head is your personal favorite and has affected your own life.
Well, for that question, I'm going to give you my book on Lewis. It's an old one, so I can give them away. I'll give one away next week, too. Don't worry, they're not for sale anymore, so I'm just kind of giving them. But I think what really has influenced me is Lewis's idea of laughter. And in the Screwtape Letters, laughter, chapter number 11, he talks about 4 kinds of laughter. And this is what I began to kind of explore. The laughter of flippancy, where we laugh at other people, we sneer, we snicker. Over coffee, we wink about how someone is so stupid. Then there's the laughter of fun, in which when you have a child and the child plays, the child is laughing, and there's no other reason for it. Then there's joke proper, where you do tell funny stories. And Lewis tried a couple jokes. He was awful at jokes, but he was very good at wit and kind of responding to people. But the last kind of laughter is joy. And joy is the laughter of reunion. And when you come together, when you haven't seen people for a long time and all of a sudden you see their face again, what do? You often laugh. Just looking at them, you laugh. They're not uglier, but they're there. They're your people. And so that little essay, chapter 11 in Screwtape Letters, has been kind of one of my key areas to look at. But then Chronicles of Narnia, The Silver Chair, is still wonderful as well. Silver Chair is going to be coming out as a film next. All the other films were awful. I hope this one works.
Why were the other films awful?
Because Prince Caspian in particular, Disney took it and they created this little kind of teenage romance. They put in pop music. Lewis would have died. He would turn over in his grave. And just they made him schmaltzy. Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first one was the best of all three of them. But the other two just become so cluttered that you really can't tell what Lewis was saying in the book. And each of those books has a significant doctrine that it's teaching. And so, for example, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe is about the incarnation and the resurrection. The Last Battle is about eschatology. The Magician's Nephew is about creation. And so all of these books have a doctrine that he's trying to teach. He wrote discursive works that really match. What I do with my students, I make them take a Chronicle of Narnia and one of Lewis's other books. I match them together and I say, show how they're the same book. And all of a sudden, when they're looking at them, they find passages that Lewis wrote here, but then he translated in a fictional way. They go, wow, this is it. For example, one of the great examples of that in Mere Christianity, Jesus has his trilemma that you may remember. He says that Jesus Christ is either a liar, a lunatic, or he's telling the truth. Okay? And he can't be. With what he says, he's got to be one of those three. And of course, he's telling the truth. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the professor comes down, and Peter and Susan are worried about their little sister Lucy because she's gone to this Narnia land, and they think she's growing a little balmy. Or maybe she's just lying and making this up. And so the professor says, wait a minute, don't you remember your Aristotle and Plato? Kind of use logic here. Is she the kind of person who lies? No. Do you think that she's crazy by looking at her? No. So what is your other option? So he's saying she's either a lunatic, a liar, or she's telling the truth. So he takes that same concept that he had in Mere Christianity and he embeds it in the Chronicle of Narnia. And that happens with a lot of his literature when you go back and you find the parallels that are there. Does that help?
Yes.
Good. Yes?
How would you compare the works of C.S. Lewis with those of J.R.R. Tolkien?
Tolkien hated Lewis's Narnia Chronicles. He just hated them. He said he just smulched them together. He wrote so fast. Tolkien, to me, is epic. Tolkien is just what he has created without any kind of religious language is Catholic orthodoxy. I mean, it's a wonderful kind of epic picture. And Peter Jackson, I think, really got it well there. Lewis is a kind of a, as he confessed himself, a quack writer at times. He writes really fast and he doesn't rewrite. Tolkien was so meticulous. I mean, and I have a friend who is finishing his first book, and he is like Tolkien, and I'm like Lewis. I throw things out, and I just, oh, here's a joke I can put in here somewhere. And you begin to realize that the person who takes time, like Tolkien, is really a great artist. And he was a master of languages, Icelandic, Nordic languages. But Lewis was really kind of this cosmic scholar where he put all things together, and they fit for him. But once he said it, he put it out. I love them both, but they're two different times. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit would never have been published if it had not been for Lewis. Lewis would sit at the Bird and the Baby, the Eagle and Child pub, and they would read out their works to each other. One of my favorite people, though, was Hugh Dyson. Hugh Dyson was a wit. He was an Anglican like Lewis, and he would sit there and he hated Tolkien stuff. And Tolkien would start reading, and he'd go, not another effing elf. I don't want to hear. Okay? He was just very rude with his language, but that's most Episcopalians anyway. You know, I'm kidding. I'm sorry. Sorry for going off like that. This is why my wife doesn't want me to speak in public and answer questions. The BBC was even worse. It was sweet, but it was sweet. I did like Lucy in the film version of Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. She was just, Georgia was beautiful, just very apt. But the problem with films, as Lewis says, there's death in the camera. Once, when you read, the characters change, and your imagination really takes hold. Once you've seen Aslan or Lucy or Edmund on the screen, they're stuck in your mind. You go back to the book, and all of a sudden, you're seeing them a little more. It's the problem of imprinting images and ruining literature.
I was wondering, could you comment a little bit on what you think about what Lewis does with the character of Susan? She's in Narnia beginning, and it's been a long time since I've read the last book, but I know that she's relatively absent, and there's an implication that she lost her faith and so forth.
That's a wonderful debate of what happens to Susan. At the end of the last battle, the three of the children, Peter, Edmund, and Lucy, are in a train accident. Susan is not with them. And so she does not go on to Narnia and to the afterlife. Susan also has been corrupted by lipstick and nylons. Now, She became a teenage girl. But what you have to realize, there is a subtext to this that Lewis is dealing with. Lewis had just been through the war, and who was stationed in Great Britain during the war? American GIs. What did they have to give British girls? Lipsticks and nylons, okay? So here you get this kind of corruption of the American consumption and materialism, where Susan has been seduced by that. But at the same time, he writes in a letter that Susan's fate is not yet decided. Susan is still on her journey. And after this kind of tragedy, the rest of her family, who knows what she will do. So I think there's still hope for Susan. But yeah, she puts away childish things, as she thinks.
Pick up on that theme for a bit, if you would, Terry. That this C.S. Lewis, who was one of the things that his child was still so much alive, and he talked about the importance of reading children's literature, and versus being a quote-unquote adult. Could you just comment on that a little bit more?
Yeah, Lewis had two strands in him that really made him just a wonderful scholar and teacher. He had reason. He had a first in studying philosophy at Oxford University, but he also had a first in studying literature, and he thought imagination was. And he says the problem today is that we are not watering the parched deserts of children's imaginations. We are basically just giving them knowledge or giving them technology, and there's nothing on the technology. And they have become so conditioned. He was writing back in the 40s and 50s of what children were kind of suffering from. And he says, we need to create this kind of imagination in children. Don't let them just have YouTube and movies and television series, even though they're interesting. Sit down with them and read stories. And the stories kind of awaken children because they begin to ask questions. And I think the best memories I have with my two children are just really sitting with them and reading with them at bedtime, sometimes the same story over and over again. And so my daughter is a middle school teacher of literature, and my son is a comedy writer in California. And both of them are telling stories and using their imagination. I think that's one of the most wonderful things. And grandparents can do it more than anyone else. Because grandparents, Lewis says, tell the truth. Parents tell it the way it should be, but grandparents say, no, this is what really happened. And there's something wonderful when children hear this kind of truth from grandparents. No, when your parents were growing up, when your mother, let me tell you some things she did. And it's wonderful because it creates a sense of, I am one with my parents, I am like them, and we share this kind of humanity.